All right, here we are for another installment of Beginning App and 2D Game Development. This is part 4 actually part 2 of the game design series. There's actually going to be more than 2 parts covering arrays and inheritance, so this is part 2 of the game design series, probably one of the last ones you'll watch of Unit 4. And in the game design series this week, we're talking about the game development process, specifically game design. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. We got a lot to cover. So game design is a central sort of pillar of the game development process. Last time we talked about the general high concept document. This time we're talking more about the specifics of the game design itself. And with this notion, we want to talk about the creative process involved as well as the core design. So I hinted at this last time. What's at the sort of the center of this discussion is how do we nurture the creative process? Creativity isn't just random intellectual anarchy, do whatever you want. Thoughts are associative. There's actually a famous quote that says there's no such thing as original art. Basically, the idea is that all thoughts are derivative of some other thing. We're a product of our environments, basically. And we generate new ideas by combining other ideas. It's kind of like a lattice of association, if you will. It's a tapestry of interconnectivity between various ideas. The trick is to notice patterns in those associations and how things relate to each other. So, for example, if you're trying to create analogies in games, you might say, well, what is the similarities between post office delivery and network traffic routing? Well, they're all delivering things, right? So, or if you're delivering pizzas, for example, if you're playing the Spider-Man game where you have to be Spider-Man and actually deliver pizzas, that is the same deal as post office delivery, really. It's all the same ideas. So you take these ideas in real life and you somehow figure out a way to apply them to a video game. And so when you're doing that, you need to think about how those ideas that you've created relate to other ideas that might already exist. Really kind of a simple concept, but something to think about nonetheless. So, you want to stuff your head with concepts and associations. How do you actually go about doing that? Well, the best way probably is to read. Probably all great designers are great at reading, watching TV, reading comic books, reading novels, experiencing the world. I remember once at Radical Entertainment, my lead designer was reading about deep sea animals for some reason. We ended up having these awesome deep sea creature kind of concepts in one of our Ultimates design for even way before the Ultimates was sort of a popular thing in mass media. This was during the Ultimates comic book days, and that ended up being a creature in one of the game concepts that we were pitching at the time. You should make reading a lifelong process. You should broaden your reading. Read everything you possibly can. Game design books, history, religion, politics, culture, and ask yourself questions as you're reading. And I would say this slide even goes beyond just reading. It gets into watching films as well, listening to music, asking yourself questions about that music, asking yourself questions about those books that you're reading. It builds a creative foundation for you. Obviously, you should play games. You should play a lot of games. I'm here. I am, a teacher, and I'm telling you, go and play a ton of games. And if your teachers and your parents disagree with me, you can just say, well, I want to be a game designer. Now, that said, you also need to obviously study very hard. There's a lot of hard concepts in this course. It's very fast-paced. We're already on arrays, and we're only at week 4. But we get way more complex in game software development than we do in other types of software development, so you got to keep up. But along the way, make sure to play a ton of games. I just mentioned, my most recent games I've played. If you want, go ahead and go onto the forums and start a discussion group on the most recent games you've played. I'll contribute as I have time. My most recent games are Papers, Please and Gone Home. So basically, you should also try to play more than just computer games. Try to play board games, Avalon Hill type games, RPGs, um, Lord of the Rings Confrontation, anything you can. RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, for example, is a great game to sort of get into for expanding your horizons, and that's one of the ways I got into creating games was through playing Dungeons and Dragons with friends. It's a great game that allows you to kind of play it in any style you want to, and that really allows your imagination to just kind of freely flow between various games. And of course, computer games. Even inside of computer games, you should be constantly broadening your horizons. Pick titles you wouldn't actually play normally. It's fine if you like FPSs, but you should also try other different genres. You should really become a student of games, learn from them, go to the bargain bin. There might not be great games in there, but there might be some cool ideas that are just perhaps poorly executed. I often like when I talk about, well, and poorly executed is a bad phrase, perhaps just not executed as well as the one that became popular is. But if you want to consider games that perhaps had ideas originally and then just became popularized by other games that were derivative of that, look no further than Blockland. Blockland is a game that was made with the Torque game engine years ago, originally in November 2004 as freeware. I was lucky enough to play this game back in the days before Minecraft. Here's examples of spaceships built by a Blockland user, for example. Here's a Temple Ruins created by Blockland users. Looks a lot like Minecraft, right? Well, basically Minecraft just took this idea and ran with it and made it even better. The Torque game engine had limitations at the time, so the Minecraft people, Mojang that is, went and made a better engine that could handle it better. Really, it's just a matter of improving and iterating on various ideas. And of course, if you compare that to Minecraft, original release date, well, it says 2011. It seems to me that it came about before that time. It was originally scheduled for 2009, but 5 years earlier than this was Blockland. So a lot of games are like that. And if you go through the budget bins, if you look through independent games, look through games that are less popular, you're going to occasionally find these gems of ideas. And that is what ends up creating a great game, because you figure out a way to essentially like make that game better. When we were creating X-Men Legends at Raven, when we were creating Marvel Ultimate Alliance and Ultimate Alliance 2, these games we channeled Baldur's Gate, Dark Alliance, and of course Marvel Ultimate Alliance went on to sell more than Baldur's Gate, Dark Alliance, but nonetheless we used that as a game earlier on that we just studied the heck out of it. And so you become a student of these games and you study from these games, you learn how they're made, and you make your game better, or you iterate on that idea somewhat. Another way is film. Perhaps things like Alien, Dungeons and Dragons. Games are not as broad as film for inspirations, but you can definitely get inspiration from many sources, just as film gets inspiration from many different sources. Draw upon opera and movies with subtitles, random lectures, scuba diving, anything that removes the idea of still thinking from your minds. It's easy to make a first-person shooter that happens in the Desert Storm era, for example, but how creative is that? It's not very creative at all. We want original gameplay, original ideas, freshness, especially as students. You have a chance to be fresh and unique. Brainstorming has been studied. There's been some common elements found about these. A lot of times what people do in really great brainstorming environments is they say no idea is a bad idea. So you throw everything out on the table and you don't argue with the ideas that are thrown out initially. You just kind of throw them all out there And then eventually you'll start to, after everyone's exhausted all your ideas, then you'll start to prune those ideas. I was just part of that in the recent train jam I was on, where we brainstormed in a train depot what kind of ideas we could come up with. You want to be intensely emotionally involved about the problem at hand. You want to, lure people in through your intensity and through your sort of emotional involvement in the game. You're, as the creator, you want it to be you want to be sort of invested in your idea, struggle with your idea, and struggle to overcome some kind of a problem with the idea. And finally, you might find yourself to kind of get the glimpse of what makes that idea perfect. And that solution should leap to the forefront. It may even seem obvious at that time. It might seem like, why hadn't I thought of this before? I can guarantee you that's what the Mojang people were thinking of, for example, when they thought of Minecraft originally. Or what, I've mentioned a lot of games here. I'm obviously kind of drawing parallels to a lot of different games, but what anyone on any successful game has thought, what the original Batman Arkham Asylum people thought when they made what is now the best the best console-based superhero game of all time. They were thinking of what it means to be Batman, and that brainstorming process of what we could do as Batman really ended up leaping to the forefront. Now it just seems like an obvious game that you would make. There's not many industries that can claim to deal in daydreams, but that's what we're doing. I can't tell you how many times I've had an idea for a game in a dream or something. I wake up and I have to write that idea down right away. That is what it means to be a game developer. You're constantly thinking about it, you're dreaming up new ideas, you write them down. Most of them won't get made, but every once in a while they will. And you got to keep working on those ideas. Don't get tied down to technology. Don't get in bed with any sort of implementation on it. Just use it for an idea in and of itself. That 1% inspiration is what Edison called as the genius, and then the 99% is the actual work. So after that 1%, everything else is hard. Think of raw ideas that you can throw into the game. Come up with a hybrid maybe. Look at what can be contributed so others can get emergent into that game. A lot of ideas shouldn't grow any further. They're just ideas, and they're not necessarily good ones. You have to be aggressive at this point in your brainstorming process. Be ripping apart your own ideas. Others are going to rip your ideas pretty soon. So now is the stage for you to start ripping those ideas apart. And then you can push your idea to a publisher, and you can already have explanations to protect that idea. And perhaps those who are producerly minded might have political ways to explain around those inhibitions. You have to ask yourself, once you have that idea, is it actually good? Is it worth spending your time and money on? Is it just a rehash that could bring improvement to an original idea and just has new challenges? Also, obviously, discuss this with someone that can appreciate that idea. So once you have that idea, you need to sort of coalesce it into something you can explain to others and sort of use that as a reality check. That's what this next part is about. So you go from having the idea, brainstorming, to having the idea, to growing the idea, to the beginning of the creative process, and actually the reality check. Next, you need to define the product. What's the target audience? We covered some of this last time in the high concept doc. What are the core objectives? What are the challenges for that game? How does the player interfere with the game? What are the things the player does? How does that controller, remember the good old controller that I've got handily here all the time? I mean, you need to feel what that game is like in the hands of a player. And I encourage you to actually, there's something about physical human touch that we're hardwired to. So if you're actually touching the controller while you're thinking of the game that you're about to make, you can actually, you sort of like, you can start to like get your mind into what that game is that you're about to create. Designing by committee is as I mentioned before, is something to be avoided as much as you possibly can. Famous quote: "The only useful document ever designed by committee is the Constitution." But you do want to blend like-minded people together, and that can be very effective. I remember I was in the room for the first time Prototype, the game, was actually brainstormed and sort of pitched to the team. And we all just kind of got around this concept. We all had sort of like it wasn't a hive mind, but it was more like we understood what the idea of Prototype was, and the idea that you would take these powers from others and you essentially became the superhero and you were taking on these powers. It was really a powerful sort of moment in my career that I got to be part of that. It wasn't a committee because it was just ad hoc. It was just a group where Eric Holmes, who was the designer of Prototype, the original creative Prototype, and eventually the director on Batman Arkham Origins as well, he eventually just said, I've got this idea. I'm going to pitch it to you guys, see what you think. And then eventually we ended up coming up with our one-pager. And we had early meetings where we focused on the design and not the technical, just like we've got stated here. This is from a book called Gameplay and Design by Kevin Oxland, pro game designer. So we wrote all the ideas down. These would come in handy later. Incorporate all those changes into sort of a 2 or 3 page document. This moves on to the concept document, which I talked about last time. So you have to ask yourself, what is a game? What is gameplay? What's interactivity? What is gameplay balance? All of these are important things to think about in terms of the core design. We're going to cover the topics of what a game is, what's gameplay, and what's interactivity. We'll get to game balance and look and feel next time. So, a game is what's different from a game and a movie. I'll pause here for you to think about that. Well, a movie does not have interaction. Its outcome is fixed. It's a story. It's just played out in a linear nature. Okay, then what's a toy? Toy has interaction, but there's no real end goal to it. You're just kind of screwing around with it. Still, you can develop your own goals. That's sort of what we call immersive gameplay, I guess, if you want to call it that. But, a toy is different than a game because it's got, it's just sort of this thing that you can sort of configure and sort of imagine, but it doesn't actually have an end goal and objectives and all that kind of thing like a game does. So definitions from the Introduction to Game Development by Steve Rabin. He says play is the ability to have interactions to elicit emotions. And a game is an object that provides rule-bound play. And a frame is the border of a game's context. Inside that frame is the game, and outside the frame is real life. So you basically provide a frame. You provide a frame, and inside that frame is the game. And the game operates all in this space. And then outside of the game is real life. So when we say we've got like cartoon physics, for example, cartoon physics exists in this frame, and it perfectly makes sense in this frame. Outside, in the real world, it makes no sense. So inside this frame, you have to do things that make sense inside of this frame. The stuff outside you can sort of do whatever you want with that because it doesn't matter. All that matters is what's inside the frame and that it coexists in a world in which that frame is composed of. And then, of course, outside of the frame, we have to abide by the rules of real life. Another definition from Steve Rabin is aesthetics being the emotional responses during play. And those 4 definitions are pretty general enough to cover the basic idea of what is a game. A computer game specifically is a software program. It's not a board game or a sports game. So if we think about chess versus soccer versus Warcraft, you have to ask yourself, what are we losing in each of these? What are we gaining? In one, we're losing the physical pieces. Soccer, for example, we're losing the social interaction. We're gaining real time, we're more immersive, and we're more complex. Actually, if I was to edit this over, I might say social interaction. You're still gaining that in in Warcraft because it's obviously multiplayer, so you're able to get some social interaction out of World of Warcraft. Computer game involves players. Well, yep, but we're stressing this because you got to think about the audience that's involved. It's not just for you. In fact, it shouldn't be for you, but it's for them. We broke the rules on our train jam that I told you about, the game jam, because a lot of times people make those games for themselves. They just do it to sort of goof off. But when we're actually making games, like real games that we're hoping people care about, we're making those games for customers. We're making those games for users, for fans of gaming. One of my favorite times in the industry so far to date was actually when I had just left Radical Entertainment. I was coming back to Wisconsin to form Frozen Codebase. And I was driving alone. The rest of my family flew back to Wisconsin from Vancouver. And I stopped. The game Hulk, Ultimate Destruction, had just gone on sale. I stopped at a Walmart in the middle of, like Montana, I think it was. And it was on one of those kiosks they have in the aisles of Walmart. And I just watched fans of those types of games play the Hulk. And I could just tell we had a hit on our hands. And I was so proud because I didn't tell them who I was or anything. I'm not one for having an ego in that regard. I just wanted to watch them and just see if they had fun playing it, and they sure did. So it was really cool to watch them just destroy stuff and just be the Hulk out. And that reminded me again why I make games. I make them for fans, and you have to always remember that there are those players, and players are the primary reason we make games. We have to remember what the game is about. It's about making decisions. What weapon do you use? What resource I build up? It can be really frustrating if your decisions don't matter. You want actual good gameplay, which is the next major topic we're going to talk about. We want our game to be about control. We want players to be able to impact the outcome of the game. We want players to be able to rise above any kind of problems that they might have in the game and actually be able to overcome any sort of obstacles. There can still be uncontrolled sequences, but they should be made to be logical. And you also need to have a goal. So, for example, in Zelda, defeat Ganondorf. Long games might have sub-goals, recover the Triforce first, the Sword of Power, etc. Without game goals, a player ends up developing their own. It's like a toy, like Grand Theft Auto style. And that can be a fun sort of sandbox game as well. Some people consider, for example, I've mentioned Minecraft so many times, it's obvious I'm a huge fan of that game. Some people consider that to be like a toy. It is essentially the ultimate sandbox game. However, people have essentially gone and developed their own mini games to put inside of their own Minecraft servers. So it now has become a game that does have goals inside of it that players have just developed on their own. So it's sort of a game within games. And I think that's really an interesting way to create a game as well. Here's what a game isn't. It's not just a bunch of cool features. That might be called maybe a game engine, but that's not essentially a game. It's also not a lot of fancy graphics. You could just be a movie if you wanted to do that. Here's a famous quote from Sid Meier. When a designer is asked how his game is going to make a difference, I hope he talks about gameplay, fun, and creativity, as opposed to an answer that simply focuses on how good it looks. That's a trap we get in as developers, where constantly people want better and better looking games. And so we get trapped in this notion of that's all that matters, when what really matters is the gameplay of it. It's also not just a series of puzzles. Puzzles can be fun to have in games, but we're not just going to present a whole bunch of disconnected puzzles and call that a game. It's also not just an intriguing story. You want it to be interactive so that, for example, in the Baldur's Gate, if you go the wrong way, that might get you killed. But interaction in a world which all leads to the same end is just a story. So computers are good at interacting. They allow for a lot of interactive fun. There's plenty of examples of this where you're compelling and you don't have goals. So SimCity, Grim Fandango, some of these things aren't really full games. They're more of a toy, but they're still a lot of fun. So next up, the next topic and the last topic we're going to cover for week 4 here is gameplay. So it used to be thought that you could not teach game design. It's more of an art. But obviously, people teach art. And even to teach art, there's technical disciplines such as there are in music, film, and poetry, even inside of art. So computer game designs are just like an art form. But you can teach the design practices. You can teach things like game theory, for example. Game theory is something you can think of about the theory of how games are played. Game theory is a branch of economics. It's basically a branch of how systems are governed by rules, and you can mathematically analyze the payoffs and various endpoints. Game theory assumes rational players that want to maximize their gain. And another way of thinking of it is that gameplay is a collective of strategies to reach endpoints in game theory. And you have to be specific to which game activities you're going to undergo and what the player is going to be allowed to do. This includes utilities, which are measures of desired associated with an outcome, and payoffs, the utility value for any given outcome, as well as the bias of players towards a specific utility. And again, gameplay isn't necessarily everything. In GTA 5, the choice of what car you use isn't always about payoff, but might be about fun. No one really expects gameplay in movies or plays. No one says, hey, where's the gameplay in Hamlet? But first off, it should be fun. It should be interactive. And it can have gameplay. You can have interactive storytelling that's essentially just an interactive story, but it doesn't necessarily have to have gameplay. So let's think of an example. We've got an adventure game with a knight, a dwarf, a priest, and a thief. During combat, the knight and dwarf are in the front. The thief fires arrows. The priest casts spells. He's got bolts that do damage equal to the sword and band-aids that can heal equal to the sword. Which spell the priest should cast comes down to which opponents they're fighting. Does that opponent have 6 arms? How many opponents have weak attacks? Because the band-aids can, heal all various types of attacks. In this case, we can always decide which is better. So it's maybe not as interesting. We can always sort of know that, okay, if it's a single opponent, they're equal, so I just do an E-bolt. If it's against, or I could even do a Band-Aid if I wanted. If it's against an opponent with 6 arms, I'd probably want to do bolts because I'd want to be able to quickly get that opponent down. If it's against many opponents, I'm going to need a lot of different Band-Aids to be applying to the knight and the dwarf and the thief. But what if the Band-Aids still had to affect a single target and E-bolts had a different area of effect? So E-bolts would do less damage, but the armor doesn't make a difference. Now, suddenly, the spell that the priest should cast isn't obvious. It makes a series of interesting choices. So again, Band-Aids are going to have a single target, but E-bolts have an area of effect. So they do less damage, but over time, it propagates out. So your E-bolt is going to kind of explode on impact and hit other creatures near it. So the position of those creatures matters, and they're going to be moving towards you, so their position is going to be changing constantly, which means they're going to be accumulating different values of damage. So all of a sudden the answer isn't easy, and now we have interesting choices. A choice is a question asked to the player. What do I cast? Do I cast a bolt, an energy bolt, for example, or do I cast a Band-Aid? And the outcome is the end result of that given choice. And then the possibility space is that set of possible events and a landscape of choice and outcomes. Choices should be non-trivial, with upsides and downsides to making each choice. If there's only an upside to everything, then the AI could easily take care of it. If there's only a downside to using it, then no one would ever try. So, for example, we could have a ray gun that plays music. Well, that's pretty cool, but pretty soon you're going to want the BFG. What do you think the taunt is for in Nintendo Smash Bros? It doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of for looks, but the upside, maybe it's social. You might ask yourself what other upsides there are in other types of games that you've played. So what's the upside of using one thing over another? I know that in some shooters, for example, there's an upside to using a knife because you look kind of cool, like if you took them out with just a knife, for example. The gameplay value when using upsides and downsides and the payoff depends upon other factors. So Rowan Horseman, but what if other player recruits pikemen? That's going to cause a problem if Rowan Horseman was the one that's chosen. So there's kind of a upside and downside decide depending on what factors are chosen. Bazooka is effective against a tank, but the player could get out of the tank, the other player could. So you want to have well-designed choices with desirable and undesirable effects, and they should be related back to player goals. Qualities of choice, this comes from the Rabin book. Hollow, be lacking of consequence. Obvious leads to no choice to be made. Unformed is arbitrary decisions. Weighed is that there's a good and bad in every choice. Dramatic means you're going to choose that because it's strongly connected to your feelings. BFG might be considered very dramatic, for example. Immediate effects are immediate. Long term, these effects are extended over long periods of time. Maybe they're tied into the story or the further character development. Gameplay should be a series of interesting choices. So using a health potion may depend upon whether or not whether you have a net for capturing more fairies. So if you don't have one and you can't get more of those, then you might, conserve that health potion for a certain amount of time. Having the net in the first place might depend whether or not you need the space for more arrows or boats. In most games, you can't carry an unlimited number of things, and that's a choice, a trade-off choice you have to make. So well-designed games need some kind of a strategy, and games must display that complexity in order to be properly complex enough to be fun. Also, don't make too many rules. Less is more in this case, and a real-world example would be termites placing one piece of mud, and this results in a hive just by placing that one piece of mud. It might seem, that, we should have a ton of rules to make a variety of different things, but in actuality, you want simple rules that can build upon each other, and you want emergence to come from that interaction of rules. So we've got more topics here, including the dominant strategy problem, avoiding trivial choices, environments plus rules equaling gameplay. But for now, for the quiz content, we're going to end on the implementing gameplay 404 slide, which is slide 30. We're about 34 minutes in, and this was just a taste of gameplay, just sort of a taste of game design, and you will be getting way more game design in the coming weeks. I'm going to kind of splice game design in with the programming in the coming weeks. As I said, on Friday, we're going to have a video talking about the design of the shooter, as well as some of the next steps in coding up the shooter. So that is it for the first round of Unit 4 videos. The next one you'll find is on Friday, which will be the video about the shooter. So, all right, well, good evening and good night. I will be coming back at you on Friday for more content. Good luck on the quiz this week, and make sure to get your projects, mini projects submitted. Those are due by Tuesday of this week. Well, 6 days from now. Our weeks always end on Tuesday, right? So technically the mini project is due at the very end of Unit 4. All right, thank you.